Hey everybody, Mr. J here. Today we are going to be going through the integumentary system, which is a very big long word that literally means on top of a roof. So think about what the roof of your body is, technically, your skin, right? So today we're going to be talking about the skin, and I just wanted to show you a quick picture of a tattoo everybody should have of their mother, of course. Mom, if you're watching this, you're welcome. I don't have this yet, but I'll get right to it. Okay, so today we're going to be going through several different learning objectives. Think of these as kind of the study guide of this whole presentation. So we're going to talk first about what the heck an organ is, because this is the first organ system we're going through as a class. And then we're going to obviously name the biggest organ of this integumentary system, which is the skin. We're going to relate the layers of the skin to burns. So you may have heard of first-degree burns and all these different things. We're going to classify those and talk about how they relate to the layers of the skin. We'll talk about skin color, the accessory structures like nails and sweat glands and sebaceous glands, and then finally talk about the functioning of the skin as well as its role in healing a wound. So we got a lot to get through. It's going to be exciting, and hopefully this will help you understand everything that you're reading in a textbook, as well as just if you're watching this for fun, God bless you, and I hope this helps you as well. All right, so first off, introduction. What is an organ? Well, an organ is any structure of the body that has multiple tissue types. So when we think back to tissues, we've got all these different tissue types like muscular, like nervous tissue, connective tissue, as well as, oh gosh, I'm forgetting the last one, so help me out. Nervous, connective, muscular, and epithelial tissue, right? Well, the skin has all four types of connective tissue, and we'll see that here, or all four types of tissue, and we'll see that here in a second when we look at a picture. So first off, anytime you're talking about an organ, whether it's a heart, kidney, skin, spleen, all of them have many different tissue types clustered in. Just a couple fun facts. Skin is the largest organ of the body by weight. So if you were to skin yourself and weigh it, it weighs, I think, give or take 8 to 10% of your body weight is your skin. So that's kind of freaky to think about. If you ever skinned like a cat or, oh, not a cat, like if you're skinning a deer or something like that, you can definitely tell that that has some weight to it. Furthermore, if you've ever worn a leather jacket, you are wearing cow skin. And you can tell that it's got some weight to it, right? If you're wearing a leather jacket, it's pretty heavy. So biggest thing with the skin and biggest function, we'll talk about these later, is it's the barrier between the external environment and the internal environment, which is why it's so vital to have it. It's going to protect you from pathogens. It's going to keep you warm and insulated and all these other things, which is why these suckers are really bad for you. So if you've ever had a burn before, you know that they're either first, second, or third degree burns. And if you can see, you can probably assume which of these is the worst, right? The third degree burn is likely going to be the worst burn. But do you know why that actually is? Some of you might say, well, maybe it was because I was in a fire for like 10 seconds, right? Whereas first degree burns is I kind of touched something hot and pulled my hand away real quick, right? So this isn't as dangerous. This is really dangerous, okay? Why are there three classifications though? Because it's due to the depth of the burn. So if you look at the skin, so I'm going to look at the skin structure first, and then I'll talk about the three main layers. If you see, so this is the outside of the skin, so the most superficial. This is the most deep, okay? And as you can see, there's multiple sort of layers here, right? We divide them into two main layers of the skin, and then we add in a third. So the first is the most superficial. It's called the epidermis, okay? Epi means on top of, dermis means basically skin. So right below the epidermis, this really big layer is called the dermis. It's got a lot of fun things that we'll talk about. And then below that is primarily connective tissue like adipose tissue, which is called the subcutaneous layer, and it connects the skin, so the epidermis and dermis, to the underlying muscle layer. So if you kind of pull your skin up, you are basically pulling up the epidermis and dermis, and then underneath that, if you were to open yourself up, you'd see this kind of layer of fat that's connecting that skin to the muscles below, which is kind of fascinating, okay? So we have three layers of skin. Think about burns again. First degree burn is when you burn only through the epidermis, okay? So it's a really, really superficial burn. Second degree burns, you've now gotten into the dermal layer. So kind of this more important layer, right? There's a lot of stuff in here. And then third-degree burns are even worse, where you're burning through this subcutaneous layer, which is that last sort of layer of protection, and now you've exposed your muscle layer with all its blood vessels and stuff. So that's why second and third-degree burns are really dangerous, and you might need a skin graft. You will need a skin graft for them to protect it, because now you've exposed blood vessels. And if you know anything about bacteria and viruses, they love to hop into your blood vessels and get everywhere in your body and really cause a lot of issues. So first-degree burns really aren't bad. Second and third are really bad, and you need to get medical attention. So let's talk about these layers a little more. First off, the epidermis is going to be an outer layer of what's called stratified squamous epithelial tissue. Okay, so what the epidermis looks like are these layers, right, of stratified squamous epithelial tissue. That means many layers of kind of flat cells. And as you can see, so this is the epidermal layer, this is all the dermis, so we'll get to that next time. But you see a lot of these cells, as they move upwards, they're going to be flattened out and flattened out and flattened out, okay? So with that, it forms this really nice, thick, abrasive layer of protection for the underlying structure. So the main goal of this epidermis is primarily to just protect the dermal layer underneath. There are 5 layers of the epidermis, and you can remember them by this mnemonic that I will write really quickly. Come, let's, oops, here we go. Come, get out of here. Clear all my drawings. Here we go. Come, let's get sunburnt. Okay, if you take the first letter of each, that's the first letter from superficial to deep of all the layers of the epidermis. So look at this. Come, stratum corneum. Let's, stratum lucidum. Get, stratum granulosum. Sun, spinosum, burnt, basal. Okay, so each layer of the epidermis you can remember by come, let's get sunburnt, and those are the 5 layers. Now, why does it say stratum first? Well, I told you that this is a stratified epithelial tissue, right? Stratified squamous. That means there are layers to it. So it's basically saying, hey, this layer is the corneal layer. This layer is the lucidum layer, okay? So those are the 5 main layers of the epidermis. And a couple other structures I want to point out here. We'll talk about the basal layer a little more because there's some important cell types there. But right below, you can see these little dermal papillae. That literally means skin nipples, okay? I want you to look at your skin nipples. They're your fingerprints. So if you look at your fingerprints, those are little projections, basically, of the dermis and epidermis combining together to give these little ridges, and those are your fingerprints. You have them on your fingers primarily, and your toes, and you can also see some thin layers, little bumps on other parts of your body, but primarily in your fingertips and your toes, which is really fascinating. So that's where your fingerprints come from. So I told you we're going to talk a little bit more about the basal layer. Okay, so this is the base layer of the epidermis, so all of these guys down here, okay? One cell type that's in the basal layer is called a melanocyte, literally meaning melanin cell. You've heard of melanin before. Melanin is a protein. So we talked about proteins being basically the structure and function of all of our cells. So melanin ends in IN, so it is a protein. That protein provides a pigment to your skin. So first off, the goal of melanin is not to give skin the color, but it's to actually protect it from DNA damage. Where does that DNA damage come from? UV radiation in the sun. So that's one reason you wear sunscreen, is almost to amplify this protective effect that melanin's trying to give you, and it protects you from that UV radiation because that can damage the DNA of your cells. If you damage the DNA of your cells, you can have some issues like cancer potentially. Okay, so that's the goal of melanin, and the more melanin you have, the darker your skin will be. This is why if you have darker skin, you usually don't wear as much sunscreen, because you already have that protection from the UV radiation because you're producing a lot of melanin, okay? So that's a really cool fun fact. There's a couple different types of melanin too when we talk about hair color. Eumelanin is a little darker and pheomelanin is a little more reddish yellow, lighter. So we'll talk about how that relates to hair color here in a little bit, because your hair is basically skin, but it's specialized. So we'll get to that here in a second. So those are melanocytes. So those are found in that basal layer, okay? And they look really cool. They produce a lot of this protein, and then these cells almost eat off the melanin And this is still in the epidermal layer, remember? And they're just eating off these little pigments of melanin to almost like, here, I want a little protection, I want a little protection, I want a little protection from the sun, right? So it's just protecting this basal layer as well as the lower layers of the epidermis from that UV and UVA radiation, okay? So I talked about skin color a little bit. Let's go into that a little bit more. So again, we have different skin colors as people, and it's not due to how many like melanin cells we have, melanocytes we have. It's actually based on how much melanin we produce. So some people, their genes are more apt to produce a ton of melanin, and that's usually when you have darker or black skin. And if you have less melanin being produced, you have more pale white skin because you just don't have that pigment as much. And it's due to a variety of factors like genetics, like I said, your genes, as well as environmental and physiological factors. So for example, if you live in Sweden, okay, the UV rays aren't that strong, so you don't have to produce as much melanin to protect your skin. Okay, so therefore they're a little more pale in color, right? Whereas if you live near more the equator, okay, the equator of the Earth has a lot of bombardment from the UVA and UVB rays. Therefore, it's going to cause more issues. Therefore, people who live along the equator usually have a little darker skin to protect them from the UVA and UVB rays. So those are a few fun facts. A couple other things can affect skin color, and you might know this. So for example, if you are embarrassed, so say you're in front of your parents when you're 12 years old, they say something that embarrasses you, what happens to your face? It gets red, right? You blush. And that is due to vasodilation of your blood vessels in those areas. Okay, so for some reason, when you get embarrassed, those blood vessels dilate, making your skin really red and kind of pinkish. And that's why you blush. Okay. The reverse is also true. When you are cold and you're trying to conserve heat, all of those vessels will actually constrict, trying to keep the heat in, and your face will appear more pale or maybe even more blue. So fun fact there. A couple other things that could happen too. You have hemoglobin in your bloodstream, and when it's oxygenated, so when there's oxygen bound to hemoglobin, so what that would kind of look like, if I can draw it real quick, what that would look like is you've got your red blood cell. Okay, so let's say this is your red blood cell, and you've got these little proteins on it called hemoglobin proteins. Okay, and when they are bound to oxygen, so an O2 molecule, they appear very red. So it's interesting is this is the same process that happens when iron rusts or when metal rusts, it kind of turns that reddish color. That's because oxygen is being added to that metal. Well, in your blood cells, you've got a little metal in here called iron, and it binds to that oxygen and literally rusts your blood, turning it red. So it's almost like you're rusting your red blood cells, turning them red. Now, if the hemoglobins do not have oxygen bound to it, so a lot of the times they can kind of be scrubbing some CO2 and less oxygen itself, sometimes these can appear more blue or purplish. And this is called cyanosis. So this is where cyanosis comes from. Literally means the condition of blue. So you look a little blue. It's not because you're sad, it's because your oxygen levels are low in your blood. So you have low oxygen levels. A lot of the times you see this in newborns, they appear kind of blue, they have this cyanosis. And a lot of the times it's because they have low blood oxygen. They're using their lungs for the first time, so they're trying to breathe and they're crying and they're really sad because this is a really uncomfortable environment. They were in this warm, marinating place inside of their mother. Now they're cold and stressed, right? And now they need to learn how to breathe and breathe in oxygen themselves. So a lot of the times the babies will look blue because they have low oxygen in their blood. They're learning how to breathe. And then eventually that blue will go away as they get oxygen circulating in their body. So a lot of fun facts there. Then lastly, you can also have jaundice or orangish skin as well. So the orange skin sometimes comes from an increase of beta carotene in your blood, things from like sweet potatoes and carrots. So you can appear kind of orange, very rare. You would have to eat a lot of that. But jaundice is when you appear kind of yellow. And a lot of the time that happens when you have liver disease and you have bile leaking into your bloodstream, which is actually very dangerous. So if you ever see somebody who is jaundiced and their eyes look yellow, their skin looks yellow, they should probably go to urgent care or the emergency room because they're probably having liver failure. So that's kind of dangerous. So that was skin color. I kind of hopped. So first we started talking about the epidermis, went into skin color, and now we're going to talk about the dermis, which is that next thick layer, okay? So let's go back to that dermis. I'm just going to point out a few things in the dermis. Biggest thing is that the dermis has a lot of blood vessels. So you see all these like red vessels and blue vessels. This means that this layer has a blood supply. If it has a blood supply, it's going to stay alive well. It's going to feed these tissues and keep those cells working well. That's an interesting point. You don't see blood vessels in the epidermis. So interestingly enough, as the epidermis from the basal layer up, as the cells divide and divide and divide and push up, push up, push up, they lose a blood supply, which is why if I do this, I'm sloughing off a bunch of dead cells because those cells lost their blood supply. They basically filled with protein and keratin and melanin sometimes, and then they just slough off. They're dead cells. The reason being is because they're away from their blood supply. So that's a fascinating fun fact. Furthermore, there's a lot of other accessory structures in the dermis, like the erector pili muscle. When this is triggered, you get goosebumps, like when you're cold or potentially stressed, or you see the love of your life and your hairs stand on end. All of these are because this erector pili muscle is pulling that hair follicle up, sticking it straight up, hopefully trying to keep you a little warmer or just inducing kind of a little stress response too. We'll talk about these nerves later on in this class. You get a lot of nerve endings in the dermis. So if you ever actually feel like pain or a prick, it's because you've pricked deep into the dermal layer to hit these nerves, and it sent a signal to your brain saying, hey, like you're in pain or you're experiencing some sort of physical touch. And then you've also got your sweat glands right here. They can be merocrine or apocrine. We'll talk about those later. And you can also have sebaceous glands, which I'm not sure. Yeah, there's one right here. So here's your sebaceous gland. And this guy is going to secrete some oils to waterproof your skin, sometimes to prevent bacteria from getting on it. But then sometimes when you're growing up, you produce too much oily stuff and it gets deep into that hair follicle, and then you get some blackheads and all these other issues and acne. So your sebaceous glands are super hyperactive during puberty, which is why you get acne, just overactive sebaceous glands. Okay, so that was a lot of the dermal layer. So there's just a lot of good stuff in the dermal layer. And yeah, I'm just going to keep moving on. So here are some accessory structures we're going to talk about. So first off, nails. Nails are basically specialized epidermal cells. So they're just hardened because they have produced a bunch of proteins called keratin. Okay, so these cells, as they get pushed upward in your nail roots, they produce a lot of keratin. When it gets a lot of keratin, it gets really hard and it continues to get pushed out to the nail tip. So what's happening here is you got these dividing cells that fill with keratin as they get pushed up, and then it gets pushed out to the free edge until obviously you clip it or you break it off. So at this point, all these cells are dead. All these cells are dead. They're just filled with this protein. They're not doing anything, but they're tough to give that sort of protection, right? Which is why there's an issue if you rip out the cuticle and the base of that fingernail, because then you might rip out some of the stem cells that were dividing to produce the nail, and sometimes it won't grow back as well. Okay, so that's a nasty little part of the nail. And the big reason we have nails, there's a lot of hypotheses for this, is it's primarily to just protect this area a little more and maybe give us a little more grip and scraping possibilities. So obviously in like dogs, they have sharper nails to like claw prey. So these don't really, they help us with a little bit, but it's not like essential for our survival. It's more of a vestigial structure. If you've heard of evolution, you know what vestigial structures are. I won't go into that. So those are nails, okay? Then hair is similar to nails, and except instead of keratin, there's going to be more melanin, which gives that pigment, so a color, right? So like brown hair, black hair, blonde hair, those types of things. Just like the nail, there's going to be these stem cells on the base, okay? These are like basal cells of the epidermis. They're going to basically divide into the hair bulb region, okay? And they're going to fill and fill and fill with different pigments until they get pushed upward to the hair shaft and the hair root themselves. At this point, they're going to die and just produce basically a bunch of protein and then get pushed out until you actually see the hair itself. So this is a really cool picture of what these hair follicles look like. And I think I said that wrong earlier. There's also keratin in it, but there's also melanin in the hair cells as well. So it kind of gives it that strength and structure as well as its color. And this is an electromicrograph, I believe, of a hair follicle kind of emerging, growing up. So kind of a cool thing. So this is what I talked about with hair color. It's primarily due to melanin. We talked about eumelanin being that brownish black, the pheomelanin being a little lighter. Okay, so that determines your hair color. And as you get older, you don't produce as much melanin. So therefore, you have white hair. So the reason you get white hair is because your cells are like, you know what? I'm tired of making melanin in these hair follicles. I'm just going to like not produce any more melanin. Therefore, there's no pigment. Therefore, it appears white. It's not because you're more wise, it's just less protein, okay? I'll get harangued for that. Anyway, we talked about erector pili muscles, so we can move on. Awesome. So now we're into the glands. So glands, these are all exocrine glands, which means they secrete some fluid out of the body. So in this case, it's going to be secreting fluid either into the hair follicle or out into the skin. Both of them are on the outside of your cells, so they're exocrine glands. So first off, we talked about those sebaceous glands. So they fill with the secretion and then they release this oily substance called sebum. And I said it waterproofs and moisturizes, protects the hair shafts and skin. These are overproduced when you are in puberty because your hormones like to stimulate these suckers and they just go crazy. That's why you get acne. And then you got sweat glands. So these are merocrine glands. This is because the cells actually just release fluid from themselves, whereas the sebaceous glands are holocrine glands. That means the cells themselves are like popping off and then they just blow up and release all of their secretions. So it's just a little different of how they're released. I don't really care that you memorize that by any means, but it's just the difference between holocrine and merocrine. Now, between the two sweat glands, there's eccrine and apocrine. It's just based on location primarily, as well as the scent in a way. So the eccrine glands are found a little higher up in the epidermis. So I showed you eccrine glands earlier. Let's see if I can find it quick. So these sweat glands that are a little higher up would be the eccrine glands. Or these as well, the sweat glands, and these are just going to produce the normal sweat that you think of with salt and fluid, and the goal of that is to obviously cool your body off. So they respond to body temperature changes. So when you get too warm, obviously these will secrete sweat, therefore the water will evaporate off your skin, cool you off. Whereas the apocrine gland, they say merocrine glands, they're incorrectly named. I don't exactly know why. I think it's due to the apocrine glands are a little deeper in, and they don't exactly act the same as these eccrine glands, but don't worry about that. So these guys like to become active at puberty, okay? These secrete the sort of sweat with proteins and other things that smell a certain way. You may know the certain way that they smell if you've ever had a teenager in the house, right? They produce your body odor, okay? So not only the body odor itself from like armpits, right? So these axillary areas, it's body odor as well as, interestingly, pheromones. So what puberty really is you are becoming of age, right? So that you can reproduce. And if you look at other animals, they produce these things called pheromones through these similar glands, and it almost attracts other things towards itself. So if it's like a female, it'll secrete pheromones and males will smell that, notice it, and then go towards the female. Now, it's kind of interesting because for humans, our body odor usually doesn't smell the best, right? So it's kind of an interesting thing. But at the same time, the secretions more of the inguinal areas is a little more sweet smelling. So that's kind of an argument that it's a pheromone that's supposed to attract the opposite sex. And body odor is just kind of an interesting byproduct of these apocrine glands as well. So I digressed a little bit there, but again, those become more active during puberty. And like you saw, they are secreted into the hair follicles. It's more for protection and waterproofing of the hair follicles and the other regions of that skin. And then there's a couple different glands. These are actually modified sweat glands, if you think about it in terms of embryology. The ceruminous glands, there we go. They are the wax secretors in your ears. They exist to trap dust and other disease-causing agents that can get into your ears. And then mammary glands are similar to that, and they secrete the milk when you are nursing to feed the baby. So very interesting there. Now, everything I just said, you could describe them as functions, right? Think about sweat, maintaining homeostasis for your body temperature. Think of all the protection that I mentioned, right? From the sebaceous glands to the protective layer of the epidermis, protective covering. Waterproofing, boom. Pigment from UV radiation, pressure sensory receptors, right? Excrete waste, didn't really talk about that. And I didn't talk about making vitamin D. So your skin cells also produce vitamin D, which is really important to get out in the sun. But most everything else I already talked about, right? So it's really interesting. If you just looked at the structures and talked about what they do, you're already describing a function of the skin. So I'm not really going to go through that anymore. Talked about body temperature regulation, right? So when you're warm, vessels will dilate. You'll become a little more red to allow more surface area to basically have that heat escape from your body. So as you can see right now, I'm really warm. So my vessels in my forehead are really big. So it's trying to let off more heat from my blood by vasodilating this vessels inside of my skin. And then secondly, on the reverse side, if you want to keep heat in, those vessels will constrict and kind of conserve that heat towards yourself. And then we also talked about sweating too, cooling the body down. I'm not going to talk about hypothermia. It's just too hot, too cold. Dangerous things can happen after that. Last thing I think is the healing of wounds. So first off, let's look at what a wound would look like. The biggest issue comes from when a wound penetrates into the dermal layer. Why? You start bleeding, so you're losing blood, and there's sensory receptors and all these other things that could go wrong. So if you get a cut in the epidermis, you really don't worry about it, nor do you notice it. But it's once that gets into the dermal layer, that's when it causes issues. So a few things happen here. You can just remember these steps. Once this wound occurs, the first thing you want to do is prevent as much blood loss as possible. So the first thing that'll happen is platelets will accumulate in those broken vessels and kind of plug that area up. Secondly, you're going to have macrophages that will be activated. This means big eaters, think white blood cells, that will aggregate to the area in response to the wound and start eating basically bacteria and leftover fibers that were produced when this injury occurred. So it protects you against getting pathogens into your body. That's the second thing. And then these fibroblasts will come here, and fibro means fiber, blast means to build. Okay, so we're building back fibers to heal the area. They're the big healers and laying down these proteins to kind of protect the area and reproduce what was there before the wound occurred. And then obviously other white blood cells will come to the area too. Things like lymphocytes, things like neutrophils, they'll basically back up the macrophages and prevent infection. As this happens, okay, blood's clotted, fibroblasts are building back the fibers. Eventually, that epidermal layer will basically regenerate itself in that wound. But sometimes it was so deep that the fibroblasts, when they were secreting protein, specifically collagen, sometimes there will be these layers of collagen that didn't get kind of reordered once you had that wound, and that's when you get a scar. So I've got a scar on my wrist. I'm not sure if you can see it. Right about there. It's really small now, but that cut was so deep that the collagen laid down from that wound stayed the way it is. And so now I have that permanently. So that's a collagen layer that doesn't change. All right. That's the skin, y'all. So there's a lot of things that are in the skin that we don't necessarily think about. Hopefully this was a good overview of the important parts, what the skin does, melanin and keratin and all these different things. So yeah, hopefully this was helpful. Make sure you like the video if it was helpful. And thank you for watching. I hope this helped.